Hey guys, tonight we're stepping onto the scale of history to look at something almost everyone has tried at least once. The desperate, sometimes deranged, occasionally deadly quest to lose weight with a pill instead of a salad. Forget gummy bears and green juice. We're talking about the real stuff. Yellow pills that turned your skin the colour of a highlighter. Rainbow capsules prescribed like candy. A weight loss drug so effective it also happened to cook people alive from the inside. Before you get too comfortable, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're actually enjoying yourself here. A huge, sincere thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. Requests like yours genuinely shape where this channel goes, and I appreciate every single one of them more than you know. We're also now live on Spotify, so if you'd rather drift off to sleep there, the link is in the description. Now dim the lights, maybe get a fan humming in the background, and settle in. Have you ever wondered why the diet industry keeps reinventing the same broken wheel every 20 years? Did people really used to eat tapeworm eggs on purpose? Was there truly a diet pill made of the same chemical used in explosives? And what happens when a nation of stressed-out parents gets handed a bottle of what is essentially legal speed and told to enjoy dinner parties? Congratulations, you've just swallowed something you probably shouldn't have, and the year is 1825. Let's find out how we got from vinegar to Ozempic. Long before anyone knew what a calorie was, you were already trying to starve yourself thin, and you were doing it with something you probably have in your kitchen cabinet right now. The vinegar and water diet, popularised in the early 1800s and famously associated with the poet Lord Byron, promised that a daily dose of diluted acid would melt fat away, while also, conveniently, making you look pale and interesting. The theory, such as it was, held that vinegar disrupted digestion so thoroughly that your body simply gave up trying to extract nutrients from food, which is less a diet plan and more a hostile takeover of your own stomach. You'd wake up, choke down a glass of watered-down vinegar on an empty stomach, and spend the rest of the morning feeling like you'd swallowed a jellyfish. Byron himself reportedly lived on biscuits, soda water and vinegar for days at a time, achieving the gaunt, haunted look that would later be described as romantic, and which today would simply be described as a medical emergency. The appeal wasn't subtle. In an era without antibiotics, indoor plumbing or reliable dentistry, looking fashionably fragile suggested a kind of delicate constitution that the wealthy found deeply attractive, as though your ability to survive on stomach acid alone was somehow a personality trait. Never mind that the actual side effects included tooth enamel erosion, since vinegar is, chemically speaking, an acid that does not care whether it's dissolving salad or your molars. Your breath, unsurprisingly, took on the aroma of a pickle jar left out in the sun, which one imagines did wonders for your social calendar. Digestive distress was common, as was the sort of persistent, low-grade nausea that made eating anything else feel like an act of rebellion. And here's the truly maddening part. Any weight you did lose was almost entirely water and muscle, not fat because your body wasn't burning anything. It was simply too busy dealing with an acid assault to bother processing food properly. It's the nutritional equivalent of putting sand in a car's gas tank and being surprised when the engine stops running smoothly, then calling that a fuel efficiency breakthrough. Physicians of the era were split. Some praised the method as bracing and invigorating, using words that suggest they had perhaps never tried it themselves. Others quietly warned that repeated exposure could damage the stomach lining permanently. A warning that, shockingly, did not stop anyone. The trend spread well beyond Byron's admirers, filtering down into fashionable society as a quick fix for anyone who wanted to shed a few pounds before a ball or a portrait sitting. Recipes varied. Some called for plain vinegar diluted in water. Others suggested adding a bit of honey to make the whole ordeal marginally less horrific, as though a spoonful of sweetness could really disguise the fact that you were drinking something meant for salad dressing. servants were sometimes tasked with mixing the concoction fresh each morning, presumably while wondering what exactly their employer had done to deserve this particular chore. What's remarkable is how long the myth persisted. Variations of the vinegar diet resurfaced repeatedly over the following 2 centuries, rebranded and repackaged, but never really improved, because the underlying claim that acid alone could dissolve fat was never true to begin with. It didn't matter. The idea that suffering equaled results was, and remains, one of the most durable myths in the history of dieting, and vinegar was simply the first bottled version of it. So the next time someone tells you apple cider vinegar is the secret to weight loss, know that you're hearing an idea old enough to have been fashionable among poets, who also thought consumption gave you a certain glow. It didn't work then, and it doesn't work now, but at least in 1825 nobody was trying to sell you a gummy version of it. By the late 1800s, you had graduated from drinking vinegar to something far more ambitious, swallowing an actual parasite on purpose. Advertisements for tapeworm pills promised effortless weight loss, a permanent house guest that ate your food for you, and the small footnote that you were now hosting a living creature inside your intestines. The pitch was almost admirable in its shamelessness. Why bother with willpower, portion control, or exercise, when you could simply outsource your appetite to a flatworm that would happily consume whatever passed through your digestive tract, leaving you thinner without any real effort on your part? The advertisements, often tucked into the back pages of newspapers alongside miracle tonics and questionable corsets, featured illustrations of impossibly slender women accompanied by text promising results without diet or exercise, which should have been everyone's first clue that something was deeply wrong. In reality, most historians now believe these pills were something of a scam, selling either nothing at all, or in some documented cases actual tapeworm eggs smuggled into a capsule. If you were unlucky enough to receive the real thing, the tapeworm would hatch inside you and grow, sometimes reaching lengths of up to 30 feet, coiling through your intestines like a very patient houseguest who has decided to stay indefinitely and rearrange the furniture. Symptoms included abdominal pain, diarrhea, and a general sense of unease that presumably intensified once you realized what was actually happening inside your body. Some users did lose weight, technically, since a full-grown tapeworm is perfectly happy to consume a meaningful percentage of whatever nutrition you take in, essentially turning you into a landlord for a creature that never paid rent and never left voluntarily. Removing the worm once you'd had enough was its own ordeal, often requiring purgative medications strong enough to expel the entire creature in one deeply unpleasant sitting, an experience that likely made you reconsider every decision that had led you there. And if the worm broke apart during removal, which it often did, fragments could remain behind and simply grow into a new tapeworm, meaning your weight loss journey had technically become a weight loss subscription service with automatic renewal. Doctors of the era were, unsurprisingly, alarmed, and public health officials eventually cracked down on the more blatant tapeworm pill advertisements. Though the underlying myth proved remarkably sticky, even decades later, rumours persisted of celebrities and socialites secretly using tapeworms to maintain impossibly thin figures, rumours that have never been definitively proven, but that refuse to die, much like, one imagines, a tapeworm itself. The truly bizarre part is that some of this folklore trickled all the way into the modern era, with people occasionally still asking doctors, apparently in earnest, whether a tapeworm might help them lose those last stubborn 10 pounds. It is, medically speaking, an extraordinarily bad idea, carrying risks ranging from severe malnutrition to intestinal blockage to infections that can spread well beyond the gut. But in the 1800s, with limited understanding of parasitology and an even more limited understanding of consequences, the tapeworm pill represented something almost poetic, the exact moment dieting culture decided that the fastest path to thinness ran directly through willingly infecting yourself. It wouldn't be the last time history made that particular trade. What's almost funnier than the scam itself is how long it lingered in the cultural imagination, resurfacing periodically in tabloid rumours about actresses and socialites long after any respectable physician would have laughed you out of the office for suggesting it. There's something almost admirable about a hoax with that kind of staying power, a lie so appealing it managed to outlive multiple generations of genuine medical advancement. You have to wonder how many people quietly, privately wondered whether swallowing a parasite might actually be worth it, weighing the abdominal cramping against the promise of a smaller dress size, and deciding the math somehow worked out in the parasite's favour. It didn't, of course, but the fact that anyone seriously considered it tells you almost everything you need to know about how desperate this particular chapter of human history could get. In the early 1900s, doctors decided the fastest way to burn fat was to speed up your entire body. So they handed you a pill made from ground-up animal thyroid glands and told you to enjoy the ride. Your thyroid, it turned out, controlled your metabolism, and cranking it into overdrive with someone else's gland extract came with side effects that felt less like weight loss and more like being plugged into a wall socket. The science, at least on paper, wasn't entirely wrong. Thyroid hormone genuinely does regulate how quickly your body burns energy, and a sluggish thyroid can absolutely contribute to weight gain. The problem was that doctors of the era had essentially no reliable way to measure whether your thyroid was actually underperforming, so the extract was handed out with the enthusiasm of someone distributing free samples at a grocery store, regardless of whether you needed it. You'd take your daily dose, ground from the thyroid glands of pigs or cattle, and within days you'd notice your heart racing, your hands trembling, and a nervous, jittery energy that made sitting still feel like an act of extraordinary willpower. Sleep became a distant memory. Your appetite did decrease, technically achieving the goal, though mostly because your body was too busy dealing with an artificially accelerated heart rate to think much about food. Weight did come off, sometimes dramatically, because you were essentially forcing your metabolism into a state that mimicked hyperthyroidism, a genuine medical condition that, left untreated, can seriously damage the heart. Doctors prescribed it with a casualness that seems almost unthinkable now, treating thyroid extract as a simple, metabolic tune-up rather than the hormonal sledgehammer it actually was. Patients reported chest pain, heart palpitations, and in more severe cases, cardiac events that were quietly attributed to other causes, because nobody was tracking these outcomes with any real rigour. The pills were marketed under various brand names throughout the early 20th century, often bundled into general tonics and remedies that promised to address everything from fatigue to nervous exhaustion to, of course, unwanted weight. You didn't need a prescription for many of these formulations, so the extract found its way into households well beyond anyone with an actual diagnosed thyroid condition, distributed like a nutritional supplement rather than the potent hormonal intervention it truly was. The irony is almost too perfect. A treatment designed to correct a slow metabolism was instead being used to artificially manufacture a fast one, essentially trading one hormonal imbalance for another and calling it progress. By the 1930s and 40s, as endocrinology matured into an actual medical discipline, doctors slowly began recognizing the dangers of prescribing thyroid extract to people with perfectly healthy thyroids. The practice didn't disappear overnight, but it gradually became more regulated, more measured, restricted to patients who could demonstrate an actual deficiency, rather than anyone who simply wanted to drop a dress size before summer. Looking back, thyroid extract represents an early and uncomfortable template for the entire diet drug industry. Identify a legitimate biological mechanism, apply it indiscriminately to anyone willing to pay, and worry about the cardiac consequences later. It would not be the last time medicine borrowed a hormone's function and handed it out like a party favour, and it certainly wouldn't be the last time your heart would end up paying the actual bill. Consider it the opening entry in a ledger that would keep growing for the better part of a century, one gland, one chemical, and one exhausted cardiologist at a time. By 1933, you had moved on from animal glands to industrial chemistry, and the result was dinitrophenol, a compound originally used to manufacture explosives and dye. It worked spectacularly by cranking your metabolism so high that your body essentially began cooking itself from within, and you knew you were overdosing when your skin turned a cheerful shade of canary yellow. Marketed under names that sounded reassuringly clinical, dinitrophenol was hailed in medical journals and popular magazines alike as a genuine breakthrough. A pill that seemed to make fat simply vanish without the tedious business of dieting or exercising. And to be fair to the chemistry, it did work, in the sense that a house fire also technically works if your goal is warmth. Dinitrophenol functions by interfering with how your cells produce energy, causing the body to burn calories at a wildly accelerated rate as heat rather than storing them as fat. This sounds appealing until you remember that your body still has to survive the process, and cooking yourself from the inside out is not generally compatible with continued existence. Users reported profuse sweating that soaked through clothing within minutes, a relentless internal heat that made cool rooms feel unbearably warm, and in severe cases fevers so extreme that the body simply could not cope. The margin between an effective dose and a lethal one was uncomfortably narrow, which meant that the same pill that melted away pounds for one person could quietly kill another who had taken only slightly more. The yellow skin discoloration, caused by the compound itself, became an unofficial warning sign among users, a ghastly built-in indicator that you had perhaps taken this particular miracle cure a bit too far. Cataracts developed in some long-term users, a side effect nobody fully understood until it was too late to reverse, leaving people with permanently damaged eyesight in exchange for a smaller waistline. Reports of deaths began surfacing within just a few years of its introduction, and yet dinitrophenol remained available and widely used for a startling stretch of time, a testament to just how desperately people wanted a shortcut and how little regulatory oversight existed to stop them from finding one. By the late 1930s, following a mounting body count and increasingly alarmed reporting, the Food and Drug Administration finally moved to restrict it, effectively ending its era as a legitimate over-the-counter weight loss aid in the United States. But like so many things in this particular history, dinitrophenol refused to stay buried. It resurfaced decades later as an underground bodybuilding and weight loss supplement, sold through grey market suppliers and online forums to people chasing extreme rapid fat loss, apparently unaware or unbothered that the compound had been killing people since the Great Depression. Modern case reports continue to describe fatalities linked to dinitrophenol use, nearly a century after its introduction, which makes it perhaps the most persistent cautionary tale in this entire story. It stands as an almost perfect illustration of a recurring pattern, a genuinely effective mechanism for weight loss, deployed with essentially no regard for the fact that the human body is not, in fact, an industrial furnace designed to be run at maximum output indefinitely. And yet, remarkably, it keeps getting tried again in one form or another, which tells you less about the chemistry and considerably more about how far people are willing to go when a smaller number on the scale feels close enough to touch. In the mid-1930s, a new class of stimulant arrived under the brand name Benzedrine, and doctors quickly noticed a delightful side effect. It made people stop wanting to eat. You didn't need to be told twice. A pill that gave you boundless energy and killed your appetite in one convenient dose felt less like medicine and more like a miracle with a shelf life nobody bothered to check. Benzedrine had originally been developed and marketed as a treatment for congestion and asthma, sold in inhaler form well before anyone thought to put it into tablets. But it didn't take long for both doctors and patients to notice its more compelling secondary effects. You felt alert, focused, and strangely uninterested in food, as though your hunger had simply been switched off at the source. Energy surged through you in a way that made ordinary daily tasks, cleaning the house, running errands, staying awake through an entire workday, feel almost effortless, if slightly frantic around the edges. Doctors began prescribing it explicitly for weight loss by the early 1940s, marketing it as a modern solution for the modern problem of overeating, framed less as a stimulant and more as a tool for restoring self-control. What nobody adequately explained, or perhaps fully understood at the time, was that amphetamine is a powerful and habit-forming drug, one that reshapes brain chemistry in ways that make stopping considerably harder than starting. You might begin taking it purely to shed a few pounds before a wedding or a summer vacation, but the tolerance built quickly, meaning the dose that worked in week 1 barely registered by week 6, nudging you toward taking more simply to feel normal. Sleep disturbances followed close behind. Since a stimulant designed to keep you alert during the day has a way of keeping you alert well into the night as well, leaving you exhausted and wired in equal contradictory measure. Anxiety, irritability, and a racing heartbeat became common companions, dismissed by many doctors as simply the price of admission for a slimmer waistline. During the Second World War, amphetamines were distributed widely to soldiers on both sides of the conflict to combat fatigue and boost alertness, which meant an entire generation returned home already familiar with, and in some cases already dependent on, the drug's effects, long before civilian doctors began handing it out for dieting purposes. By the 1950s, amphetamine-based diet pills had become an enormous and largely unregulated business, sold under dozens of brand names and prescribed with a casualness that, in hindsight, seems almost reckless. The appetite suppression was real and often dramatic, which made the drug enormously popular and enormously profitable. But the psychological dependency, the tolerance, and the cardiovascular strain were quietly accumulating in the background, waiting to become impossible to ignore. It would take decades and a substantial body count before the medical establishment fully reckoned with what it had unleashed. But in the giddy early days of Benzedrine, all anyone saw was a pill that made hunger disappear and energy appear, and in the history of weight loss, that particular combination has never once failed to be irresistible, regardless of what it costs later. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because nearly every drug that follows in this story, decade after decade, chemical family after chemical family, is really just another attempt to recreate that exact same feeling without paying the exact same price. A search that, as you're about to see, has taken considerably longer than anyone in 1935 could possibly have imagined. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, if you were a studio contract actress being paid to stay impossibly thin while working 18-hour days, the studio doctor had exactly one solution, and it came in a small tablet. Amphetamines kept you awake, kept you hungry for nothing but your next scene, and kept the scale exactly where the studio wanted it, at the cost of your sleep, your nerves, and eventually your sanity. The studio system of this era functioned less like an employer and more like a factory that happened to produce movies, and its stars were treated as valuable, replaceable machinery, expected to look flawless on camera, regardless of how little sleep or food that flawlessness actually required. Studio-affiliated physicians, often on retainer specifically to keep contract players functioning under grueling production schedules, dispensed amphetamines with an ease that would be genuinely shocking by modern standards, treating them as a routine tool for weight management and stamina, rather than the potent psychoactive substance they actually were. You'd take a pill in the morning to suppress your appetite and power through a punishing shooting schedule. Then, once filming wrapped for the day, take something else entirely, often a barbiturate, to actually manage to fall asleep despite your racing heart and wired nervous system. This chemical seesaw, stimulant up, sedative down, became a grim daily ritual for many performers, one that studios not only tolerated but in some documented cases actively facilitated, since a thin, energetic star was simply a better investment than an exhausted, well-rested one. The pressure to maintain an unrealistic body size was relentless and specifically gendered, with young actresses frequently placed on restrictive diets alongside their pill regimens, monitored by studio staff who weighed them regularly and adjusted their intake accordingly, as though they were livestock being prepared for a very glamorous auction. The psychological toll was immense, though it was rarely discussed publicly given the era's limited vocabulary around mental health and addiction. Behind the polished publicity photos and glittering premieres, many stars were quietly battling dependency, insomnia, anxiety, and the kind of chronic exhaustion that no amount of stimulant could ultimately fix, because the exhaustion wasn't really about energy. It was about being run continuously at a pace no human body was designed to sustain. Some performers later spoke candidly, usually decades after the fact, about how normalized this pill culture had been, describing it almost as an unspoken condition of employment rather than a medical intervention anyone had actually consented to in an informed way. The tragedy is compounded by how young many of these actresses were when the regimen began, sometimes barely out of adolescence. Their relationship with food and their own bodies shaped almost entirely by studio expectations, rather than anything resembling their own preferences or well-being. It's a genuinely bleak footnote in entertainment history, one that gets glossed over in the glamorous retrospectives and highlight reels, but it set a template that would echo for decades afterward. The idea that a certain kind of visible thinness was simply a professional requirement, achievable through pharmaceutical shortcut, with the human cost quietly absorbed and rarely acknowledged. The pills eventually faded from studio medicine cabinets as awareness grew and regulations tightened, but the underlying pressure they were meant to solve never really went anywhere at all. If anything, that pressure simply changed costumes and kept working the same room, resurfacing decades later in the form of extreme detox cleanses, punishing pre-award season regimens, and the quiet expectation that anyone appearing on camera should look effortlessly thin without ever appearing to try. The pill bottles disappeared from studio medicine cabinets, but the underlying arithmetic that had put them there in the first place, an industry that valued visible thinness above almost everything else, including the health of the people producing it, never actually got solved. It just found quieter, less obviously chemical ways to demand the same outcome, which arguably makes it harder to spot and considerably harder to hold anyone accountable for. By the 1950s, the amphetamine had left the movie lot and moved into the suburban medicine cabinet, prescribed freely to housewives who wanted to fit into a smaller dress size, while also cleaning the entire house twice before lunch. Your doctor called it a diet aid. Your family just called it Mom being unusually energetic about reorganizing the pantry at 2 a.m. Post-war America had developed a very particular obsession with domestic perfection, an idealized image of the suburban wife who cooked elaborate dinners, kept an immaculate home, raised well-behaved children, and somehow managed to look effortlessly put together while doing it, all without a single visible bead of sweat. Amphetamines slotted neatly into this fantasy, offering exactly the kind of tireless, hyper-focused energy that made an impossible standard suddenly seem achievable, at least for a few hours at a time. Doctors prescribed the pills under a rotating cast of brand names, framing them not as stimulants but as simple appetite control, a gentle nudge to help you stick to your diet, conveniently omitting any real discussion of dependency or side effects. You'd take your morning dose along with your coffee, and within the hour you'd feel a surge of purposeful energy that made scrubbing the kitchen floor or ironing an entire week's worth of shirts feel almost enjoyable, if slightly manic around the edges. Meals became smaller and less frequent, not through any real exercise of willpower, but simply because your appetite had been chemically dialed down to almost nothing, which your doctor considered a success and which your body considered something closer to an emergency. Weight loss followed, often rapid and dramatic in the early weeks, exactly the kind of visible, measurable result that kept women coming back for refills and kept doctors comfortable continuing to write the prescriptions. But underneath the tidy kitchens and trim waistlines, something more troubling was accumulating. Sleep became elusive, replaced by restless, wired nights that left many women exhausted in a way daytime energy couldn't fully mask. Irritability and anxiety crept in, often misattributed to the ordinary stresses of domestic life rather than the pharmacology actually driving them. Tolerance built steadily, meaning the original dose stopped working within weeks, pushing many women toward higher amounts just to replicate that initial burst of energy and appetite suppression. Some became genuinely dependent, caught in a cycle that was rarely discussed openly, since the language of addiction was still culturally reserved almost exclusively for men and for substances considered disreputable, certainly not for a pill your own family doctor had personally prescribed. Magazine advertisements from the era leaned heavily into this domestic framing, showing smiling, trim women effortlessly managing households, subtly implying that any woman struggling to maintain her figure or her energy simply hadn't found the right pharmaceutical assistance yet. It was an enormously profitable arrangement for pharmaceutical companies, one built on the quiet, unexamined assumption that women's exhaustion, hunger, and self-image were all problems best solved with a prescription, rather than any meaningful change to the impossible expectations being placed on them in the first place. By the time serious scrutiny of amphetamine prescribing practices arrived in the following decade, an entire generation of women had already spent years cycling through dependency dressed up as diet assistants, a chemical solution to a problem that was never really about willpower to begin with. In 1960, a pharmaceutical company introduced Obetrol, a tidy little combination of amphetamine salts marketed specifically as an appetite suppressant for the modestly overweight. You probably don't recognize the name Obetrol, but you would absolutely recognize what it eventually became decades later under a very different label, prescribed for a very different reason. Obetrol combined several forms of amphetamine salts into a single tablet, engineered to provide a smooth, sustained release of stimulant effect rather than the sharper peaks and crashes associated with earlier single compound formulations. Marketed with the same confident clinical language used for its predecessors, it promised effective appetite control with what the manufacturer characterized as a gentler overall experience, a claim that, in fairness, was at least somewhat true relative to the blunt instrument of pure benzodrine. You'd take your tablet alongside breakfast and notice the familiar pattern, by now well established across decades of similar pills. Hunger receded, focus sharpened, and a certain buzzing productivity took hold that made the rest of your day feel purposeful, even if your heart rate told a slightly different story. Doctors prescribed it enthusiastically throughout the 1960s, marketing materials emphasizing its usefulness for weight management in patients who found other methods insufficient, which in practice meant it was handed out fairly liberally to anyone hoping to shed some weight without dramatically altering their diet or activity level. Side effects mirrored those of its amphetamine relatives, including elevated heart rate, insomnia, anxiety, and the ever-present risk of tolerance and dependency that had already dogged this entire category of medication for decades. By the 1970s, as regulatory scrutiny of amphetamine-based diet pills intensified sharply, largely in response to mounting evidence of abuse and cardiovascular risk, Obitrol's manufacturer found the weight loss market increasingly difficult to operate in, facing new restrictions and declining physician enthusiasm for prescribing stimulants so freely. Rather than abandoning the formulation entirely, the compound was eventually reformulated and repositioned for an entirely different medical purpose, emerging under a new brand name to treat attention deficit disorder in children and adults. That new name was Adderall, and the chemical lineage connecting one of the most widely prescribed medications of the 21st century directly back to a 1960s diet pill is a piece of pharmaceutical trivia that tends to surprise almost everyone who hears it for the first time. The core combination of amphetamine salts remained essentially unchanged. Only the marketing, the target population, and the stated medical justification shifted to match whatever the regulatory and cultural moment would tolerate. There's something almost fitting about that continuity. A single molecule quietly surviving 3 separate eras of American pharmaceutical fashion, changing its outfit each time the previous one fell out of style, while the substance underneath never once needed to. It's a genuinely remarkable pivot when you sit with it. A compound literally born to suppress a housewife's appetite in 1960, quietly rebranded decades later to help a student focus during final exams using essentially the same underlying chemistry the entire time. The story of Obitrol is, in many ways, the story of the diet pill industry in miniature. A stimulant developed for one purpose, deployed for weight loss because the appetite suppression was simply too convenient to ignore, then eventually forced by regulation and controversy to find an entirely new identity in order to survive. The pill changed its name, its packaging, and its prescribed purpose, but the molecule itself never had to change a thing. By the 1960s and 70s, diet doctors had figured out that if one pill was good, 5 pills of 5 different colours must be 5 times better, and so you left the clinic with a little bag containing an amphetamine, a diuretic, a laxative, a sedative to help you sleep off the amphetamine, and sometimes a thyroid pill for good measure. It looked less like a prescription and more like a fistful of candy from a very irresponsible dentist. This particular era of weight loss medicine, often practiced out of dedicated diet clinics that operated with minimal oversight, treated the human body as a machine with several separate levers that could each be pulled independently and simultaneously, apparently without much thought given to how those levers might interact once they were all pulled at once inside the same person. You'd arrive for your appointment, step on a scale, and leave a few minutes later clutching a small paper bag rattling with tablets in shades of pink, yellow, blue and white, each one addressing a different piece of the weight loss puzzle according to a logic that made a certain intuitive sense on paper and very little sense in actual human physiology. The amphetamine handled your appetite and energy, the diuretic handled water weight, the laxative handled digestive transit, and the sedative handled the fact that the amphetamine had made falling asleep at night essentially impossible, creating a closed loop in which each pill existed largely to manage the side effects of another pill in the same bag. Diet doctors running these clinics often saw enormous patient volume, sometimes processing dozens of people an hour, dispensing near-identical regimens regardless of individual medical history, a business model that prioritized throughput and repeat visits over anything resembling careful, personalized medicine. The results, in the short term, could be genuinely dramatic, with patients losing significant weight within just a few weeks, which kept the clinics packed and the reputation of the Rainbow regimen intact for a remarkably long time, given how little sense it made from a medical standpoint. but the cumulative effect on the body of taking a stimulant, a diuretic, a laxative, and a sedative simultaneously, day after day, was a level of physiological strain that few patients or even prescribing doctors fully appreciated at the time. Electrolyte imbalances became common, driven by the combined dehydrating effects of the diuretic and the laxative, occasionally severe enough to trigger dangerous heart rhythm disturbances. The amphetamine component carried all of its usual risks: cardiovascular strain, dependency, anxiety, while the added sedative introduced its own separate risk of dependency, meaning patients could find themselves caught in dual addictions engineered directly by their own physician. Some regimens also included digitalis, a heart medication entirely unrelated to weight loss, added apparently to counteract nausea, layering yet another powerful and unnecessary drug onto an already precarious chemical cocktail. Investigative journalists and public health officials eventually began raising serious alarm about these clinics throughout the 1970s, documenting patient deaths and severe complications that had been quietly accumulating for years under the radar of formal medical scrutiny. The eventual crackdown on amphetamine prescribing effectively dismantled much of this rainbow pill industry, though it took considerably longer than it should have, given how transparently reckless the entire approach looked, even by the more permissive medical standards of its own era. Looking back, the Rainbow Regimen stands as perhaps the most literal embodiment of a philosophy that would recur throughout this entire history. More pills, addressing more symptoms, rarely pausing to ask what all those pills might be doing to each other once they were all swimming around in the same bloodstream at the same time. You left the clinic lighter in your wallet, lighter on the scale, and, as it turned out, considerably lighter on the kind of medical caution that should have been standing between you and that little rattling paper bag in the first place. Tucked into some of those rainbow regimens was digitalis, a heart medication derived from the foxglove plant, added not because you needed it for your heart, but because it made you retch slightly less at the sight of food. You were, in effect, taking a heart drug to manage the side effects of a stimulant you were taking, to manage the side effects of dieting, which is a sentence that should have worried someone sooner than it did. Digitalis had been used in legitimate cardiac medicine for well over a century by the time it found its way into diet clinics, originally derived from the foxglove plant and employed to treat heart failure and certain irregular heart rhythms by strengthening and regulating the contractions of the heart muscle. It is, by any reasonable measure, a serious and potent medication, one that requires careful dosing and monitoring because the difference between a therapeutic amount and a toxic amount is uncomfortably narrow, a characteristic it shared, somewhat alarmingly, with several other substances already crowded into your little bag of diet pills. Its inclusion in weight loss regimens appears to have stemmed from an observation that it could suppress appetite as a side effect, likely related to the nausea and altered taste perception it commonly caused in patients taking it for actual cardiac reasons, rather than treating this nausea as an unwanted side effect to be managed or avoided. Diet clinics of the era apparently decided to treat it as a feature, reasoning that a patient who felt slightly nauseated most of the time would naturally eat less, which is technically true in the same way that a person with food poisoning also tends to eat less. You'd take your digitalis tablet alongside your amphetamine and your diuretic, and the resulting combination left you with a persistently unsettled stomach that dulled your interest in food throughout the day, achieving the clinic's stated goal through what amounted to a mild, continuous state of chemically induced illness. The cardiac risks of prescribing digitalis to patients who had no diagnosed heart condition were considerable and largely unexamined at the time, since the drug directly affects heart rhythm and electrical conduction, meaning even modest overdosing could trigger dangerous arrhythmias in people whose hearts were otherwise perfectly healthy. Combined with the electrolyte disturbances already caused by the diuretic and laxative components of the same regimen, Potassium levels in particular could shift in ways that made digitalis toxicity considerably more likely and considerably more dangerous, since digitalis and low potassium interact in a manner that significantly increases the risk of serious cardiac events. Patients receiving these prescriptions were rarely subjected to the kind of regular blood testing and cardiac monitoring that would have been considered standard practice for anyone taking digitalis for an actual heart condition, meaning toxic effects could develop quietly and go unnoticed until they became acute. Symptoms of digitalis toxicity include nausea, visual disturbances, confusion, and dangerous changes in heart rhythm, several of which overlapped uncomfortably with symptoms patients might already have attributed to the other stimulants and diuretics they were simultaneously taking, making early recognition of a genuine emergency considerably more difficult. As scrutiny of diet clinic practices intensified through the 1970s, digitalis inclusion in weight loss cocktails was gradually phased out, though not before it had quietly contributed to a genuinely dangerous chapter in outpatient medicine, one where a legitimate, powerful cardiac drug was repurposed to make people feel slightly too sick to want dinner. Also stuffed into your little bag of rainbow pills was a diuretic, which didn't burn a single calorie of fat but did make you lose several pounds of water weight by the simple expedient of making you urinate constantly. The scale dropped, your doctor smiled, and you spent the next several days feeling like a raisin that had once been a grape. Diuretics work by encouraging your kidneys to excrete more sodium and water than they otherwise would, a mechanism genuinely useful for legitimate medical conditions like high blood pressure or fluid retention caused by heart or kidney disease, but almost entirely irrelevant to actually reducing body fat. None of that nuance made it into the diet clinic pitch, where the diuretic was presented simply as another tool in the weight loss arsenal, its rapid and dramatic effect on the bathroom scale treated as straightforward evidence of progress rather than what it actually was, a temporary and somewhat misleading shift in your body's water content. You'd take your diuretic alongside breakfast and spend much of the following day making considerably more frequent trips to the bathroom than usual, watching the numbers on your scale tick satisfyingly downward with each passing day, blissfully unaware that virtually none of it represented actual fat loss. The psychological effect was powerful precisely because it was so immediate and so visible, giving both patients and doctors a quick, tangible sense of accomplishment that made the entire rainbow regimen feel like it was working exactly as promised, even as the more meaningful, harder-won project of losing actual fat proceeded at whatever pace it would have proceeded at anyway, largely independent of the diuretic entirely. The physical toll of sustained diuretic use, however, extended well beyond simple dehydration and frequent bathroom trips. Chronic fluid loss disrupts the delicate balance of electrolytes in your blood, particularly potassium and sodium, both of which play essential roles in muscle function, nerve signaling, and critically, the electrical rhythm of your heart. Low potassium levels, a common consequence of prolonged diuretic use, can cause muscle weakness, cramping, and fatigue, symptoms that patients often attributed to the diet itself rather than the medication actually causing them. In more severe cases, significant electrolyte imbalance can trigger dangerous cardiac arrhythmias, a risk made considerably worse when diuretics were combined, as they frequently were in these regimens, with other medications like digitalis that also affect heart rhythm and become more toxic in the presence of low potassium. Beyond the cardiac risks, chronic diuretic use placed ongoing strain on the kidneys themselves, organs that were being asked to work considerably harder than nature intended, filtering and excreting fluid at an artificially accelerated rate day after day, with no real medical justification behind the demand. Some patients developed genuine dehydration, severe enough to cause dizziness, fainting, and confusion. particularly if they were also restricting food and fluid intake as part of the broader diet clinic regimen, compounding one problem with another in a way that should have raised considerably more concern than it apparently did at the time. The most bitter irony of the diuretics inclusion in these programs is that any weight loss through fluid loss returns almost immediately once the medication is stopped, meaning patients who relied heavily on this particular pill for their reported results were often disappointed to find the scale creeping back up within days of ending treatment, a rebound that diet clinics conveniently rarely mentioned during the initial enthusiastic sales pitch. It was, in the end, a pill that manufactured the appearance of progress while doing essentially nothing to address the underlying goal, a magic trick performed with your kidneys rather than your fat cells. Rounding out the rainbow was a laxative, included on the theory that if food moved through you fast enough, it wouldn't have time to become fat, a piece of logic that ignored basic digestion in favour of basic desperation. You are now managing your appetite, your water retention, and your bathroom schedule with 3 separate pills, which is less a diet plan and more a part-time job. The underlying reasoning behind including a laxative in a weight loss regimen rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of how digestion and calorie absorption actually work, since the vast majority of caloric absorption from food occurs relatively early in the digestive process, well before a laxative's accelerated transit time would meaningfully interfere with it. By the time a laxative sped things along, most of the calories you'd consumed had already been absorbed into your bloodstream, meaning the primary effect of the pill wasn't reduced fat accumulation at all, but simply a faster, more frequent, and considerably more uncomfortable relationship with your own bathroom. Diet clinics of the era nonetheless embraced laxatives enthusiastically as part of the broader rainbow regimen, marketing them as a way to keep your system moving and prevent the sluggish, bloated feeling that could accompany other components of the treatment, particularly the appetite-suppressing stimulants that tended to disrupt normal eating and digestive patterns in the first place. You take your laxative dose, typically in the evening, and spend the following morning contending with cramping, urgency, and a general sense of digestive chaos that some patients apparently interpreted incorrectly as evidence that the treatment was actively working to expel unwanted weight from their body. Regular laxative use, however, carries its own significant risks, chief among them the same electrolyte disturbances already caused by the diuretic component sitting right alongside it in your little paper bag, since laxatives similarly flush essential minerals like potassium and sodium out of the body through frequent loose bowel movements. Chronic use can also cause the colon to become dependent on the laxative for normal function, a condition sometimes referred to as laxative dependency, in which the digestive system essentially forgets how to move waste through the body efficiently on its own, requiring escalating doses over time just to produce the same effect and creating yet another layer of dependency stacked on top of the amphetamine dependency already built into the same treatment plan. Dehydration compounded the problem further, particularly when laxative use was combined with the diuretic and with the reduced food and fluid intake that patients were often simultaneously being encouraged to maintain, creating a body that was being drained of fluid and essential minerals from multiple directions at once while being told this represented healthy progress. Some patients developed more serious gastrointestinal complications from prolonged use, including chronic irritation of the intestinal lining and, in rare but documented cases, damage to the nerves controlling normal bowel function, effects that could persist well after the laxative itself was discontinued. The psychological dimension deserves mention as well, since regular laxative use as a weight control method has since been recognized as one of several patterns associated with disordered eating, a connection that went almost entirely unacknowledged during the diet clinic era, when the behavior was simply presented as a normal, medically sanctioned component of a comprehensive weight loss program, rather than a red flag deserving closer attention. By the time serious medical and regulatory scrutiny caught up with these clinics, laxative-assisted dieting had already quietly normalized a genuinely risky behavior for an entire generation of patients, folding it seamlessly into the broader rainbow pill philosophy that treated every uncomfortable bodily function as simply another lever to pull in service of a smaller number on the scale. It's worth pausing on how casually this was all discussed at the time, tucked into ordinary conversation with the same tone you might use to describe a new exercise class, when in reality an entire generation of patients was quietly training their own digestive systems to malfunction on command, all in pursuit of a number that, as it turned out, was barely even measuring the thing it claimed to measure. By the early 1970s, after a growing pile of amphetamine-related deaths, addictions, and at least one very public congressional hearing, the government finally decided that handing out speed-like breath mints for weight loss was perhaps not sustainable public health policy. Your once easy prescription suddenly required more paperwork, more scrutiny, and considerably more explaining to your doctor about why you needed it in the first place. The reckoning had been building for years, driven by a steady accumulation of evidence that amphetamine-based diet pills were causing far more harm than the medical establishment had been willing to acknowledge throughout the previous 3 decades of enthusiastic prescribing. Emergency rooms across the country had been quietly documenting a rising tide of cases involving cardiac events, severe anxiety and psychosis, and dependency among patients who'd originally sought nothing more than help losing a modest amount of weight, only to find themselves caught in a cycle of tolerance and escalating dosage that no one had adequately warned them about. Investigative journalists began publishing exposés on diet clinics and their loose prescribing practices, documenting patient deaths, and painting an uncomfortable picture of an industry that had prioritized volume and profit over even basic medical oversight. Congressional hearings convened to examine amphetamine abuse more broadly, drawing testimony from doctors, former patients, and public health officials who described a system in which stimulants had been prescribed with essentially no meaningful limits, distributed not just for weight loss, but for fatigue, mild depression, and a host of other loosely defined complaints that amphetamines happen to temporarily mask. The resulting legislative and regulatory response reclassified amphetamines under increasingly strict controlled substance categories, dramatically tightening the rules around who could prescribe them, in what quantities, and for how long, effectively ending the era of amphetamines as a casual first-line treatment for garden-variety weight concerns. Doctors who had once handed out prescriptions with minimal hesitation now found themselves navigating new layers of documentation and justification, required to demonstrate genuine medical necessity rather than simply responding to a patient's stated desire to lose weight. Many physicians, wary of the increased scrutiny and liability, simply stopped prescribing stimulants for weight loss altogether, a shift that patients accustomed to easy access experienced as an abrupt and often frustrating loss of a treatment they had come to rely on, regardless of the dependency that reliance often represented. The diet clinics that had flourished throughout the 50s and 60s, dispensing rainbow regimens with minimal individualized assessment, found their entire business model suddenly unsustainable under the new regulatory environment, and many shuttered their doors within just a few years as prescribing amphetamines became legally and professionally risky in a way it simply hadn't been before. This crackdown, while overdue by almost any reasonable measure, created its own set of complications, leaving behind a substantial population of patients who had developed genuine physical and psychological dependency on stimulants that were now considerably harder to obtain through legitimate medical channels. Some transitioned to whatever alternative medications remained available, while others turned to illicit sources to continue accessing the drug their bodies had become accustomed to. an unintended consequence of a policy shift that addressed the supply side of the problem considerably more effectively than it addressed the human cost already embedded in an entire generation of patients. The crackdown marked a genuine turning point in the history of weight loss medicine. The first time regulators had moved decisively against an entire class of diet drugs rather than addressing individual dangerous compounds one at a time, and it set a precedent, however imperfectly applied, that would shape how subsequent diet drugs were evaluated and approved for decades to come. The rainbow pill era was effectively over, though the underlying appetite for a chemical shortcut to weight loss, if you'll forgive the phrasing, had certainly not gone anywhere at all. It has simply been sent underground for a while, waiting patiently for the next compound, the next clinic, or the next clever repackaging that might slip through whatever regulatory gap happened to be available at the time. Regulation, it turns out, is remarkably good at closing one door and remarkably slow at anticipating exactly which window someone will eventually climb through instead. Into the resulting vacuum stepped phenfluramine, approved in the late 1970s as a supposedly gentler appetite suppressant that worked on serotonin instead of pure stimulant force. You were told this was the safer alternative, the responsible choice, the pill that had learned from the mistakes of its speed-fueled predecessors, and for a while, everyone genuinely believed it. Phenfluramine represented a genuine shift in the underlying pharmacology of weight loss medicine, working primarily by increasing serotonin activity in the brain rather than relying on the dopamine and adrenaline-driven stimulant effects that had defined amphetamine-based diet pills for decades. Serotonin plays a significant role in regulating mood and appetite, and elevated serotonin activity tends to produce feelings of fullness and satisfaction after eating considerably smaller amounts of food than you might otherwise consume, offering a mechanism for appetite suppression that didn't come bundled with the racing heart, insomnia, and jittery anxiety that had made amphetamines so problematic. You'd take your phenfluramine dose and notice, instead of the frantic, wired energy of earlier diet pills, a calmer, more subdued sense of satiety, feeling genuinely full after meals that would previously have left you wanting more, without the accompanying sense that your heart was trying to escape your chest. This felt, understandably, like real progress. A diet pill that addressed appetite through a fundamentally different and seemingly gentler biological pathway, distinct enough from the amphetamine family that it sailed through the regulatory environment that had just finished cracking down so decisively on stimulant-based weight loss drugs. Doctors embraced it with genuine enthusiasm, precisely because it seemed to represent the responsible, science-driven alternative that the field had been searching for since the excesses of the rainbow pill era, a medication that could offer meaningful appetite suppression without the dependency and cardiovascular strain associated with its stimulant predecessors. Early clinical experience seemed to bear this out, with patients reporting satisfactory weight loss and a notably better side effect profile compared to amphetamines, free of the anxiety, insomnia, and addiction potential that had plagued the previous generation of pills so thoroughly. For over a decade, phenfluramine occupied a comparatively quiet, respectable niche in weight loss medicine, prescribed steadily, but without the explosive, headline-grabbing popularity that would later come to define its most famous combination. It was in many ways a genuinely reasonable answer to a genuinely difficult problem, a serotonin-based approach that offered a real alternative to the blunt force of amphetamines, backed by a body of research that, at the time, showed no obvious cause for the kind of alarm that would eventually engulf it. What almost nobody fully appreciated during these relatively calm years was the mechanism by which phenfluramine achieved its serotonin-boosting effects, a process that involved the drug being metabolized into a compound with effects on the lining of heart valves that simply hadn't been studied over the kind of extended timeframes and large patient populations that would eventually reveal the problem. The pill worked exactly as advertised in the short term, delivering the calmer, more sustainable appetite suppression it had promised. And for years that seemed to be the whole story. It would take a fateful pairing with another modestly popular medication and roughly 2 decades of widespread use before the quieter, darker chapter of fenfluramine's history would finally reveal itself, transforming what had once looked like the responsible answer to the amphetamine era into one of the most consequential drug safety failures in the history of American medicine. Around the same era, phentermine arrived as a milder stimulant appetite suppressant, approved on its own for short-term use and largely unremarkable, until someone had the idea to pair it with something else entirely. On its own, phentermine was a reasonably boring, reasonably effective pill, the diet drug equivalent of a competent but forgettable co-worker. Approved by regulators in the late 1950s and gaining wider use through the following decades, phentermine functioned as a milder stimulant than the amphetamines that had dominated earlier decades, working through similar underlying mechanisms in the brain, but with a notably gentler overall profile in terms of both effectiveness and side effects. You'd take your phentermine tablet each morning and notice a modest reduction in appetite along with a mild increase in energy. Nothing like the intense, almost frantic stimulation associated with older amphetamine-based pills, but a noticeable and genuinely useful effect nonetheless. Enough to make sticking to a reduced-calorie diet considerably more manageable over the course of a typical day. Regulators approved phentermine specifically for short-term use, generally recommending treatment periods measured in weeks rather than months, reflecting an awareness, informed by the recent amphetamine crackdown, that even milder stimulants carried some risk of tolerance and dependency if used indefinitely. This built-in time limitation shaped how doctors prescribed it throughout the 70s and 80s, typically as a temporary kickstart for patients beginning a broader diet and lifestyle change, rather than as a long-term standalone solution to sustained weight management. Compared to its predecessors, phentermine developed a reputation as a solid, dependable, if somewhat unglamorous option, effective enough to justify its continued use, but not associated with the kind of dramatic controversy or headline-grabbing danger that had defined the amphetamine era just years earlier. It simply worked, modestly and predictably, without demanding much attention or generating much excitement, occupying a quiet, respectable corner of the weight-loss pharmaceutical landscape throughout the 70s and into the 80s. Side effects existed, as they do with any stimulant, including elevated heart rate, mild insomnia, and occasional jitteriness. But these tended to be considerably less severe and less frequent than what patients had grown accustomed to during the height of the amphetamine and rainbow pill eras, making phentermine feel almost refreshingly manageable by comparison. Researchers and physicians throughout this period were also increasingly interested in the concept of combination therapy, the idea that pairing 2 different medications, each targeting a distinct biological pathway, might produce better results than either drug could achieve alone, while potentially allowing for lower doses of each individual component and therefore a milder overall side effect profile. Phentermine, with its established safety record and its stimulant-based mechanism working through dopamine and norepinephrine pathways, seemed like a natural candidate for this kind of combination approach, particularly when researchers began looking for a complementary partner that worked through an entirely different neurochemical pathway. That complementary partner, of course, was already sitting quietly on pharmacy shelves, having spent over a decade building its own reputation as the responsible, serotonin-based alternative to earlier stimulant-heavy diet pills. Neither phentermine nor fenfluramine had generated much individual excitement or controversy, throughout their respective decades of steady, modest use. But the moment someone in a research setting decided to combine the two together, phentermine's story stopped being boring almost overnight, launching it into a partnership that would briefly make it one of the most famous and most prescribed medications in the entire history of American weight loss treatment, before eventually contributing to one of its most infamous scandals. In the early 1990s, doctors began prescribing fenfluramine and phentermine together, and the combination, nicknamed fen-phen, became an overnight sensation, with millions of prescriptions written and clinics popping up specifically to hand it out. You walked in wanting to lose 20 pounds and walked out with 2 bottles of pills and the distinct sense that you'd finally found the answer everyone had been searching for since the vinegar days. The pairing emerged from legitimate clinical research, most notably a widely publicized study demonstrating that patients using the two medications together experienced significantly greater weight loss than those using either drug alone, with results that seemed genuinely impressive and, crucially, appeared sustainable over a longer period than most previous diet interventions had managed to achieve. The theory behind the combination made intuitive pharmacological sense. Phentermine stimulant-based appetite suppression, targeting dopamine and norepinephrine pathways, paired with fenfluramine's serotonin-based satiety effects, seemed to address hunger and fullness through 2 entirely separate biological mechanisms simultaneously, theoretically producing a more complete and more comfortable appetite suppression than either drug could achieve on its own, while also allowing doctors to prescribe somewhat lower doses of each individual medication. Word spread quickly, first through medical journals and conferences, then rapidly into mainstream popular awareness, as media coverage seized on the seemingly remarkable results, and began presenting fen-phen as something close to the miracle cure that decades of previous diet drugs had promised, but consistently failed to deliver. You'd hear about it from a friend, a co-worker, a segment on the evening news, and before long you were sitting in a diet clinic waiting room that looked remarkably similar to the ones that had proliferated during the rainbow pill era decades earlier. Except this time the science behind the treatment seemed considerably more credible and considerably better documented. Demand exploded almost immediately. Clinics specifically dedicated to prescribing the fen-phen combination opened across the country at a striking pace, often operating with the same high patient volume, minimal individualized assessment model that had characterized diet clinics of previous eras, churning through appointments and prescriptions with an efficiency that prioritized throughput over careful, personalized medical evaluation. Millions of prescriptions were written throughout the mid-1990s, making fen-phen genuinely one of the most widely used weight loss treatments in American history up to that point, embraced by patients desperate for a solution that finally seemed to work as advertised, and by doctors who found the combination both clinically effective and considerably easier to justify prescribing than the amphetamines their profession had spent the previous 2 decades trying to move away from. Patients reported substantial sustained weight loss, often losing significant amounts of weight over periods of several months, results that felt genuinely transformative to people who had struggled unsuccessfully with dieting for years, sometimes decades, prior to finally finding a treatment that seemed to actually deliver on its promises. The side effect profile, while not without its issues, seemed manageable and comparable to what patients had come to expect from each individual medication, with the combination's overall reputation remaining remarkably positive throughout the first several years of widespread use, buoyed by patient testimonials and physician enthusiasm that reinforced the sense that weight loss medicine had finally, genuinely turned a corner after decades of dangerous stimulants and questionable rainbow regimens. Pharmaceutical companies capitalized enthusiastically on the surging demand, and an entire supporting industry of diet clinics, physician networks, and marketing materials grew up around the fen-phen phenomenon with remarkable speed. For a few genuinely remarkable years in the middle of the 1990s, it seemed as though the century-long search for a safe, effective weight loss pill had finally reached its destination, a conclusion that made what followed only a few years later feel considerably more devastating by comparison, both for the patients affected and for the broader credibility of the entire field. There's a particular kind of heartbreak in that timeline. The fact that so many people spent those middle years of the 90s feeling, for the first time in their lives, like the fight against their own body had finally been won, only to discover that the victory had been quietly writing a check their heart valves would eventually have to cash. By 1997, the miracle combination revealed its price tag. Fen-phen was linked to serious heart valve damage in a significant number of users, some of whom had no symptoms at all until an echocardiogram told them otherwise. The drug was pulled from the market in a hurry, and you were left wondering how something so widely prescribed, so thoroughly trusted, had quietly been rearranging the inside of your chest. The first serious warning signs emerged from a group of physicians at the Mayo Clinic, who noticed an unusual and troubling pattern among a cluster of patients taking fen-phen, several of whom presented with a rare and previously uncommon form of heart valve disease that seemed to appear far more frequently in this specific population than statistical chance could reasonably explain. Further investigation revealed that phenfluramine, once metabolized in the body, produced effects on heart valve tissue that had gone essentially undetected during the drug's original approval process and its subsequent decade of individual use, effects that appeared to become considerably more pronounced and more clinically significant when the drug was combined with phentermine and taken over sustained periods. The mechanism, researchers eventually determined, involved the way phenfluramine's serotonin-related metabolic byproducts interacted with valve tissue, triggering a thickening and stiffening process that could compromise how effectively the heart valves opened and closed, potentially leading to significant, sometimes irreversible cardiac dysfunction. What made the discovery particularly alarming was how quietly this damage could develop. Many affected patients experienced no noticeable symptoms whatsoever, no chest pain, no shortness of breath, nothing that would have prompted them to seek medical attention or raise any concern with their prescribing physician, meaning the only way to detect the problem was through a specific cardiac imaging test that most patients had never had any reason to undergo before the scandal broke. Once researchers began systematically screening fen-phen users with echocardiograms, the results were considerably more widespread and more alarming than anyone had initially anticipated, revealing valve abnormalities in a meaningful percentage of patients who had taken the combination, a number far higher than would be expected in the general population and clearly linked to the medication, rather than any coincidental underlying condition. The Food and Drug Administration moved with unusual speed once the scope of the problem became clear, requesting the voluntary withdrawal of phenfluramine from the market in September of 1997, a request the manufacturer complied with almost immediately given the mounting evidence and the obvious legal and reputational exposure at stake. Phentermine itself, having been used safely on its own for decades prior to the fen-phen partnership, remained available and continued to be prescribed independently. But the combination that had briefly seemed like the answer to a century of failed diet drugs was effectively dead within a matter of weeks. Patients who had taken fen-phen, sometimes for years, were left scrambling to arrange cardiac screening, many discovering for the first time that they carried valve damage they had never suspected, damage that in some cases would prove to be permanent and would require ongoing monitoring or, in more severe instances, eventual surgical intervention to repair or replace affected valves. The psychological impact compounded the physical one considerably, as patients who had trusted their doctors, trusted the research, and genuinely believed they had finally found a safe solution to a lifelong struggle, now had to reckon with the possibility that the very treatment meant to improve their health had instead quietly damaged one of their body's most vital organs. The fen-phen scandal became, almost overnight, one of the most significant pharmaceutical safety failures of the decade, prompting considerable soul-searching within the medical and regulatory community about how such a widely prescribed combination could have been in use for years before its most serious risk was finally identified, and setting the stage for a wave of legal and financial consequences that would unfold over the following years. For many patients, the hardest part wasn't even the physical diagnosis. It was the quiet betrayal of realizing that the miracle they'd been sold had been sitting quietly inside their chest the entire time, undetected, unannounced, and entirely unrelated to how thin they'd finally managed to become. Right alongside fen-phen came Redux, a 1996 approval that was supposed to be the next generation of appetite suppression, chemically related to phenfluramine, but marketed as new and improved. It lasted barely a year on the market before it was swept up in the same recall, becoming a footnote so brief that most people forget it existed at all. Redux, known chemically as dexphenfluramine, was developed as a refined version of phenfluramine, isolating and using only one specific molecular form of the compound in an effort to preserve the appetite-suppressing serotonin effects, while theoretically reducing some of the side effects associated with the original, less refined formulation. Its approval by the Food and Drug Administration in April of 1996 was itself notably controversial, even before any heart valve concerns emerged, with the agency's own advisory committee initially voting against approval due to concerns about the drug's modest efficacy relative to its potential risks, before ultimately reversing course under considerable public and political pressure from advocacy groups pushing for expanded treatment options for obesity, which was increasingly being reframed during this period as a serious chronic disease deserving of more aggressive pharmaceutical intervention. Once approved, Redux was marketed enthusiastically as the first genuinely new weight loss drug to receive approval in over 2 decades, a framing that generated considerable excitement among both physicians and patients who'd been navigating a landscape of amphetamine derivatives and off-label combinations for years without any officially sanctioned new option. You could take Redux on its own, without needing to pair it with phentermine or navigate the somewhat improvised, off-label nature of the fen-phen combination that was simultaneously surging in popularity through the very same period, giving it a certain appeal as the more straightforward, singularly approved alternative. Sales climbed rapidly following its launch, with the drug quickly becoming one of the most frequently prescribed new medications of the mid-1990s, buoyed by aggressive marketing and by the broader cultural momentum around serotonin-based appetite suppressants that fen-phen had simultaneously helped generate. But Redux's fortunes were inescapably tied to the same underlying chemistry that would soon doom phenfluramine, since dexphenfluramine shared the same fundamental metabolic pathway and the same effects on heart valve tissue that Mayo Clinic researchers were simultaneously uncovering in fen-phen patients throughout 1997. When the scope of the heart valve problem became clear, and researchers examined its connection to the broader phenfluramine family of compounds, Redux was swept into the same regulatory response, withdrawn from the market alongside phenfluramine in September of 1997, barely 18 months after its celebrated launch as the great new hope of weight loss pharmacology. The speed of its rise and fall left Redux with a strange compressed place in medical history. A drug that generated enormous excitement, achieved genuinely widespread use, and then vanished so quickly that it barely had time to establish itself in public memory, the way its more famous fen-phen cousin managed to do. patients who had taken Redux found themselves subject to the same cardiac screening recommendations issued for fenfluramine users, and lawsuits related to Redux became bundled together with the broader fen-phen litigation that would eventually result in one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements in American legal history. In hindsight, Redux stands as a kind of cautionary footnote layered on top of an already substantial cautionary tale, a reminder that refining and rebranding a problematic chemical compound does very little to address the underlying issue if the fundamental mechanism causing the harm remains essentially unchanged, no matter how enthusiastically the marketing department insists otherwise. Approved in 1997, Meridia promised weight loss without the heart valve drama of its predecessors, working instead by making you feel full faster. It stayed on the market for over a decade before studies linked it to increased cardiovascular risk, and in 2010 it was pulled as well, joining an increasingly long list of diet pills that worked right up until they didn't. Meridia, known generically as sibutramine, arrived at a moment when the weight loss drug market was reeling from the near-simultaneous collapse of fen-phen and Redux, creating an obvious and urgent demand for an alternative that could deliver comparable results without the specific cardiac valve risks that had just devastated the field's two most prominent recent successes. Sibutramine worked through a somewhat different mechanism than its serotonin-heavy predecessors, inhibiting the reabsorption of both serotonin and norepinephrine in the brain, which increased feelings of fullness after eating and helped patients feel satisfied with smaller meals, while theoretically avoiding the specific metabolic pathway that had caused the fenfluramine family's heart valve problems. You'd take your daily Meridia capsule and notice a genuine, meaningful reduction in appetite, feeling comfortably satisfied after meals that would previously have left you wanting more, an effect that made sustained, gradual weight loss considerably more achievable over the following months of treatment. Clinical trials supporting its approval showed modest but statistically meaningful weight loss compared to placebo, results that, while not as dramatic as the numbers fen-phen had briefly promised, seemed reasonably solid and were crucially not accompanied by any of the alarming valve findings that had ended its predecessors' careers so abruptly just months earlier. Doctors and patients alike approached Meridia with a mixture of genuine hope and understandable caution, given how recently the field had been burned by drugs that had seemed perfectly safe right up until they very much weren't. For the first several years following its approval, Meridia performed largely as advertised, becoming a reasonably popular and seemingly reasonably safe option for patients seeking pharmaceutical assistance with weight management, prescribed steadily throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s without generating the kind of alarming safety signals that had doomed the fenfluramine family so dramatically. What gradually emerged over the following decade, however, was a different but still serious category of cardiovascular concern, specifically related to sibutramine's effects on blood pressure and heart rate, both of which the drug tended to increase modestly in most patients, an effect that had been noted since its original approval but had generally been considered an acceptable, manageable trade-off for patients without pre-existing cardiovascular disease. Long-term outcome studies conducted throughout the 2000s, most significantly a large-scale trial specifically designed to assess cardiovascular safety in patients with existing heart disease or heart disease risk factors, ultimately revealed a meaningfully increased risk of serious cardiovascular events, including heart attack and stroke, among patients taking sibutramine compared to those receiving a placebo. This finding proved particularly concerning given that a substantial proportion of patients being prescribed Meridia for weight loss already carried some degree of cardiovascular risk, given the well-established relationship between excess weight and heart disease risk factors, meaning the very population the drug was intended to treat overlapped considerably with the population shown to face the greatest danger from taking it. regulatory agencies moved to withdraw sibutramine from the market in October of 2010, over a decade after its initial approval, marking yet another chapter in which a diet drug's serious risks took years of real-world use and dedicated outcome research to fully surface, following a now familiar pattern in which the initial approval process, however rigorous on paper, simply hadn't been designed to catch a risk that only became statistically apparent across a much larger population, studied over a much longer time frame than any pre-approval trial could reasonably have captured. It's a pattern you should probably start recognizing by now, since Meridio would be far from the last drug in this history to pass its exams with flying colours, only to fail the much longer, much harder test of actually being taken by millions of real people for years on end. Because prescription pills kept getting recalled, you turned to the supplement aisle, where ephedra sat conveniently unregulated, sold as a natural fat burner despite being, chemically speaking, not all that different from the amphetamines everyone had already learned to fear. It took a string of heart attacks, strokes, and one high-profile athlete's death before the government finally banned it in 2004. Ephedra, derived from a plant that had been used in traditional Chinese medicine for centuries under the name mahuang, contains naturally occurring compounds called ephedrine alkaloids that stimulate the central nervous system in ways strikingly similar to synthetic amphetamines, increasing heart rate, elevating blood pressure, and suppressing appetite through fundamentally the same adrenaline-related pathways that had made stimulant-based diet pills both effective and dangerous for the better part of a century. The critical difference, and the reason ephedra managed to sidestep the increasingly cautious prescription drug regulatory environment of the 1990s, lay in a piece of legislation passed in 1994 that classified herbal and botanical products as dietary supplements rather than drugs, subjecting them to dramatically less rigorous safety testing and oversight before they could be sold to the public. This regulatory loophole meant that ephedra could be marketed directly to consumers on pharmacy and grocery store shelves, without any of the clinical trials, dosing standardization, or ongoing safety monitoring that had, at least eventually, been applied to prescription stimulants, despite the fact that ephedra's active compounds worked through mechanisms essentially identical to the drugs that had already killed people and prompted government crackdowns decades earlier. You'd pick up a bottle labelled as a natural herbal fat-burning supplement, reasonably assuming that the word natural implied some meaningful degree of safety, unaware that the product inside worked by flooding your system with stimulant compounds capable of dangerously elevating your heart rate and blood pressure, with a precision and consistency that varied considerably from batch to batch, since supplement manufacturing lacked the standardized dosing controls required of actual pharmaceutical products. Throughout the mid to late 1990s, ephedra containing supplements exploded in popularity, marketed aggressively toward both weight loss seekers and athletes hoping to enhance performance and energy, generating a market worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually, built almost entirely on the public's reasonable but ultimately mistaken assumption that a product sold openly on store shelves without a prescription had been vetted for basic safety. Reports of serious adverse events began accumulating steadily throughout this period, including heart attacks, strokes, seizures, and sudden cardiac deaths, particularly among younger, otherwise healthy users who had no obvious pre-existing risk factors that might have explained such events absent the stimulant they'd been consuming daily in supplement form. The turning point in public and regulatory attention arrived in February of 2003, when a young, apparently healthy professional baseball pitcher collapsed and died during spring training, with an autopsy and subsequent investigation identifying ephedra use as a significant contributing factor in his sudden death. A case that generated enormous media coverage precisely because it involved a young elite athlete whose death seemed to definitively puncture the supplement industry's carefully cultivated image of ephedra as a safe, natural performance and weight loss aid. The resulting public outcry, combined with a mounting body of adverse event reports the Food and Drug Administration had been quietly accumulating for years, finally prompted the agency to take decisive regulatory action, and in April of 2004, ephedra containing dietary supplements were formally banned from sale in the United States, marking the first time the agency had used its authority under the 1994 supplement law to remove an entire category of product from the market on safety grounds. The ephedra saga stands as a particularly stark illustration of how a regulatory framework designed with good intentions, distinguishing between drugs and natural supplements, could be exploited to sell a genuinely dangerous stimulant compound to millions of unsuspecting consumers for the better part of a decade before enough bodies accumulated to force a response. It's a pattern you'll notice recurring throughout almost every chapter of this history, a genuine safety concern quietly accumulating in emergency room records and coroner's reports for years before a single, sufficiently public tragedy finally forces the regulatory machinery to catch up with what the evidence had already been saying all along. In the mid-2000s, marketers found a new angle. A cactus-like plant from the Kalahari Desert called hoodia, supposedly used by indigenous hunters to suppress hunger during long treks, was suddenly appearing in diet pills on every pharmacy shelf. You bought into the romance of an ancient natural secret, largely unaware that the actual clinical evidence for hoodia's effectiveness was somewhere between thin and non-existent. Hoodia gordoni is a succulent plant native to the Kalahari Desert region of southern Africa, traditionally used by the San people, one of the oldest indigenous cultures in the region, who reportedly chewed pieces of the plant during long hunting expeditions to help suppress hunger and thirst across extended periods spent travelling through harsh desert conditions. This genuinely fascinating piece of ethnobotanical history became, in the hands of Western supplement marketers, an irresistible narrative hook, the kind of story that practically wrote its own advertising copy, an ancient indigenous secret, untouched by modern pharmaceutical chemistry, finally being shared with a Western audience desperate for a natural alternative, following the very public collapses of fen-phen, Redux, and ephedra in the preceding years. You'd encounter hoodia supplements marketed with imagery evoking vast desert landscapes and traditional indigenous wisdom, promising an appetite-suppressing effect derived entirely from nature rather than from the synthetic stimulant chemistry that had proven so consistently dangerous throughout the preceding decades of diet pill history. The scientific basis for these claims, however, rested on a considerably shakier foundation than the marketing suggested. A pharmaceutical company had identified and patented a specific compound within hoodia believed to be responsible for its appetite-suppressing effects and had conducted preliminary research suggesting genuine biological activity, generating enough scientific interest to fuel years of enthusiastic media coverage and consumer excitement about hoodia's potential as the next great natural weight loss breakthrough. But the pharmaceutical development process ultimately stalled, with the compound proving difficult to synthesize reliably, and clinical trials failing to demonstrate the kind of robust, consistent appetite-suppressing effect that would justify continued development as an actual approved medication, and the original research partnership behind the patent eventually abandoned the project entirely. This inconvenient scientific reality did remarkably little to slow the consumer supplement market, which continued selling hoodia extract in various forms for years afterward, largely unburdened by the requirement to demonstrate actual clinical efficacy that applies to approved pharmaceutical drugs, but not to dietary supplements marketed under the same regulatory framework that had previously allowed ephedra to reach store shelves with minimal oversight. Independent testing of commercially available Hoodia supplements throughout this period frequently revealed a further complication beyond simple lack of efficacy. Many products contained little to no actual Hoodia extract at all, having been diluted, substituted, or outright counterfeited somewhere along an international supply chain, stretching from remote harvesting operations in southern Africa to supplement manufacturing facilities scattered across multiple countries with widely varying quality control standards. You might have purchased a bottle promising the ancient hunger-suppressing wisdom of the Kalahari and received, in practice, a capsule containing negligible amounts of the actual plant material, meaning even the modest, unproven effects that legitimate Hoodia extract might theoretically offer were often entirely absent from the product you'd actually paid for. There's also a broader ethical dimension to the Hoodia story worth sitting with, involving significant concern about whether the San people, whose traditional knowledge had effectively been commercialized into a global supplement industry worth considerable sums of money, received anything resembling fair compensation or recognition for the indigenous knowledge that had made the entire product category possible in the first place. A benefit-sharing agreement was eventually negotiated, though critics have argued it arrived only after considerable commercial exploitation had already occurred. By the end of the 2000s, Hoodia had largely faded from prominence as a weight loss supplement, its brief moment in the spotlight ultimately remembered less for any genuine pharmacological breakthrough, and more as a case study in how a compelling origin story can sustain a product category for years, even in the near-total absence of convincing clinical evidence supporting its central promise. There's a certain dry irony in the fact that a substance genuinely used by desert hunters to survive brutal, calorie-scarce treks ended up marketed to suburban shoppers hoping to skip dessert, a use case so far removed from its origin that the plant itself might reasonably have asked for a refund on behalf of the entire supplement aisle. In 2007, orlistat became available over the counter under the brand name Ali, working by a delightfully undignified mechanism. It blocked your body from absorbing about a quarter of the fat you ate and sent that fat looking for the nearest exit. Users quickly learned the hard way that eating a greasy meal on this drug came with a warning label you should have taken far more seriously, and often not far from a bathroom. Orlistat represented a genuinely distinct approach among the diet drugs that preceded it, working not through appetite suppression via brain chemistry, but through direct interference with digestion itself, specifically by inhibiting the enzymes responsible for breaking down dietary fat within the intestines, meaning a meaningful portion of the fat you consumed would pass through your digestive system essentially undigested rather than being absorbed and stored by your body. The drug had actually been available by prescription under a different brand name since the late 1990s, used at a higher dose for patients with more significant weight loss needs, but its approval for over-the-counter sale at a lower dose in 2007 marked a genuinely significant moment, making it the first weight loss medication available to American consumers without a doctor's prescription in decades, sold under the brand name Ali, and marketed heavily as a safe, accessible tool for anyone looking to support their weight loss efforts, alongside a reduced-calorie, reduced-fat diet. You'd take your Ali capsule alongside meals containing fat, and the drug would dutifully block your intestines from absorbing roughly a quarter of that fat, which sounds, in the abstract, like a fairly elegant and mechanically straightforward solution to the problem of excess caloric intake. The reality of experiencing this mechanism firsthand, however, proved considerably less elegant for a great many users. Unabsorbed dietary fat doesn't simply disappear, it continues through your digestive tract and eventually needs to exit your body, a process that, when a quarter of your dietary fat intake is suddenly following this unfamiliar exit route, tends to produce a range of side effects that the manufacturer's own packaging referred to with admirable directness as treatment effects, including oily spotting, gas with oily discharge, and an urgent, sometimes difficult to control need to have a bowel movement, particularly following meals higher in fat content than the drug could comfortably accommodate. Users who ignored the accompanying dietary guidance, which strongly recommended limiting fat intake to a modest percentage of total calories per meal, often discovered these side effects in spectacularly inconvenient, memorably unpleasant circumstances, learning through direct and occasionally humiliating personal experience exactly why the packaging had recommended keeping a change of clothes available during the initial weeks of treatment. Social commentary and media coverage at the time leaned heavily into the comedic potential of these side effects, with the drug quickly becoming something of a punchline in popular culture, discussed on late-night television and in magazine articles with a mixture of genuine curiosity and thinly veiled amusement at the idea of a weight loss pill whose primary drawback involved unpredictable, urgent bathroom emergencies rather than the cardiac risks that had defined so many of its pharmaceutical predecessors. Beneath the comedy, however, orlistat did offer a genuinely different risk profile compared to the amphetamine derivatives, serotonin agents, and stimulant compounds that had caused so much serious cardiovascular harm throughout the preceding decades, since its mechanism operated locally within the digestive tract rather than systemically throughout the bloodstream and central nervous system, meaning it carried essentially none of the heart valve, blood pressure, or dependency risks that had ended so many of its predecessors' careers. Clinical trials showed modest but genuine weight loss benefits when used alongside dietary changes, and for patients willing to tolerate the digestive side effects and adhere to the recommended lower-fat diet, it offered a legitimately useful, comparatively low-risk tool. Orlistat's legacy, then, occupies a curious space in this history. A drug whose side effects were considerably more embarrassing than dangerous, whose most memorable characteristic became a punchline rather than a public health scandal, and which, perhaps as a direct result of being merely undignified rather than genuinely hazardous, quietly remained available on pharmacy shelves for years after flashier, more dramatic competitors had come and gone. Through the 2010s, a new generation of weight loss drugs, including Belvic and Qsymia, arrived with far less fanfare than their predecessors, engineered specifically to avoid the heart and blood pressure disasters of the past. You may not remember either name distinctly, mostly because the industry had learned to be cautious, and cautious does not tend to make headlines. Following the successive withdrawals of fen-phen, Redux and Meridia, along with the ephedra ban and orlistat's more comedic than dangerous reputation, the weight loss drug landscape by the end of the 2000s had become a genuinely cautious, chastened environment, both for regulators evaluating new drug applications and for pharmaceutical companies attempting to develop them, keenly aware that any new medication would face intense scrutiny for exactly the kind of cardiovascular risks that had ended so many previous products' commercial lives. Belvic, approved in 2012 under the generic name lorcaserin, worked by selectively targeting a specific serotonin receptor associated with appetite regulation, a more precisely targeted approach than fenfluramine's broader serotonin effects, designed specifically to avoid activating the particular receptor believed to be responsible for the heart valve damage that had doomed the fen-phen combination over a decade earlier. You'd take your Belvic tablet and experience a moderate reduction in appetite, achieving meaningful but relatively modest weight loss over the following months, results that were real and clinically documented but considerably less dramatic than the sweeping promises that had characterized earlier eras of diet pill marketing, reflecting a more measured, evidence-based approach to both the drug's development and its promotion to prescribing physicians. Qsymia, approved shortly afterward in the same year, took a different combination approach entirely, pairing a low dose of phentermine, the same stimulant that had once partnered so disastrously with fenfluramine, with topiramate, an anticonvulsant medication originally developed to treat seizures and migraines that had, somewhat unexpectedly, demonstrated appetite-suppressing and weight loss effects as a side benefit in patients using it for its original neurological purpose. This particular pairing allowed for genuinely effective appetite suppression, while using a considerably lower dose of phentermine than had been typical in the fen-phen era, theoretically reducing stimulant-related risks while adding to Pyramet's distinct mechanism to enhance overall effectiveness, though topiramate itself carried its own set of side effects, including cognitive fogginess, tingling sensations in the extremities, and, notably, an increased risk of birth defects that required careful counselling and monitoring for any patient of childbearing age considering the medication. Both drugs achieved regulatory approval only after considerably more extensive and cautious review processes than earlier generations of diet drugs had faced, reflecting lessons the FDA had clearly internalized from decades of approving medications that later proved considerably more dangerous than initial trials had suggested, including specific requirements for long-term cardiovascular safety monitoring that hadn't existed during the approval processes for fen-phen or Meridia. Prescribing rates for both medications remained comparatively modest throughout the 2010s, well below the explosive headline-generating popularity that fen-phen had achieved in barely a couple of years during the 1990s, a pattern that reflected both the drug's more moderate efficacy compared to the dramatic promises of earlier eras, and a broader, more general wariness among both physicians and patients who had, by this point, witnessed multiple previous generations of diet drugs rise to popularity only to be pulled from the market amid safety scandals within a decade or less. Belvic's own story would eventually add one more chapter to this now familiar pattern, when a long-term safety trial conducted several years after its approval identified a modestly increased cancer risk among patients taking the drug over extended periods, prompting its manufacturer to voluntarily withdraw it from the market in early 2020, joining the long list of weight loss medications that performed adequately for years before a longer-term, larger-scale safety signal finally emerged. Qsemia notably remained on the market and continued to be prescribed, representing one of the comparatively rare success stories in this particular history, a combination drug that managed to avoid the kind of dramatic late-stage safety collapse that had claimed so many of its predecessors, even as its overall market presence remained relatively modest compared to what was about to arrive, and completely reshape the entire landscape of weight loss medicine within just a few short years. Originally developed as a diabetes medication, semaglutide, sold under the names Ozempic and later Wegovy, turned out to suppress appetite so effectively that by the early 2020s it had become a full-blown cultural phenomenon, discussed everywhere from doctors' offices to red carpets. You watched an entire industry pivot overnight, as a drug meant to manage blood sugar became the most talked about weight loss tool in a century of trying. Semaglutide belongs to a class of medications called GLP-1 receptor agonists, which work by mimicking a naturally occurring hormone in your body that regulates blood sugar, slows digestion, and, critically for the weight loss story, signals to your brain that you are full, producing a genuinely powerful and sustained reduction in appetite, unlike almost anything that had come before it in this entire 2-century history of diet pills. The drug was originally approved in 2017 under the brand name Ozempic, specifically for managing blood sugar in patients with type 2 diabetes, administered as a once-weekly injection, and it performed exactly as intended for its original purpose, helping patients achieve better glucose control with a favourable safety profile that avoided most of the cardiovascular red flags that had plagued so many previous weight loss medications throughout this history. What quickly became apparent, however, both to prescribing physicians and to patients themselves, was that Ozempic produced a genuinely dramatic secondary effect: significant, sustained weight loss, often considerably more substantial than anything achieved by previous generations of appetite-suppressing medications, occurring as an almost incidental side benefit of a drug designed primarily to manage blood sugar. You'd hear about this initially through word of mouth among diabetes patients noticing significant, often unexpected weight loss, alongside their improved glucose control, and then, with remarkable speed, through an explosion of social media discussion, celebrity rumor, and mainstream media coverage that transformed a specialized diabetes medication into arguably the most culturally significant weight loss drug in modern history within the space of just a couple of years. The manufacturer, recognizing the clear and substantial demand for semaglutide's weight loss effects, independent of any diabetes diagnosis, pursued and received a separate regulatory approval in 2021 specifically for chronic weight management, marketed under the distinct brand name Wegovy, and prescribed at a somewhat higher dose than the diabetes-focused Ozempic formulation. Clinical trial results supporting this approval were, by the standards of this entire two-century history, genuinely remarkable, with patients achieving average weight loss substantially greater than what any previous FDA-approved weight loss medication had managed to demonstrate, results dramatic enough that some researchers and physicians began describing the drug's arrival as a genuine turning point in the treatment of obesity, comparable in significance to the introduction of insulin for diabetes decades earlier. Demand exploded far beyond what anyone, including the manufacturer, appeared to have adequately anticipated, driven by a combination of genuinely impressive clinical results, celebrity endorsement and speculation, and a level of social media-fueled cultural momentum that no previous weight loss drug in this entire history had ever generated, transforming semaglutide from a specialized diabetes medication into a genuine cultural touchstone discussed on red carpets, in celebrity gossip coverage, and across virtually every major news outlet within an extraordinarily short span of time. This surging demand created its own significant complications, most notably persistent and severe supply shortages that left many patients with legitimate diabetes needing the drug for blood sugar management unable to reliably access their prescribed medication, since manufacturing capacity simply could not keep pace with the level of consumer demand that had expanded far beyond the medication's original therapeutic population. Remains, as of this telling, a genuinely open question, one that only years of continued use and dedicated long-term research will be able to answer with any real confidence. For now, all anyone can really do is watch closely, take note of everything that came before it, and try to remember that in this particular two-century story, nearly every previous drug also looked, for a little while, exactly like the one that had finally cracked the code. As demand for semaglutide exploded far beyond what manufacturers could supply, you found yourself in the middle of a strange new problem: nationwide shortages, a booming market for compounded and often unregulated copies, and a scramble that echoed, uncomfortably, the unregulated Wild West of the ephedra and Hoodia years. After nearly 2 centuries of vinegar, tapeworms, rainbow pills and industrial chemicals, you had arrived at the most effective weight loss drug history had ever produced. And somehow, the story still wasn't finished. The persistent severe shortages of both Ozempic and Wegovy throughout the early 2020s created a genuinely unusual situation in American pharmaceutical history, one in which a medication was simultaneously being hailed as a revolutionary breakthrough and being functionally unavailable to large numbers of patients who had legitimate prescriptions and genuine medical need, whether for diabetes management or for chronic weight treatment. Into this gap stepped an entire secondary market of compounding pharmacies, businesses legally permitted under certain regulatory exceptions to prepare customized versions of medications, particularly when the FDA-approved version of a drug is officially listed as being in shortage, a provision intended primarily for legitimate medical customization needs, but which suddenly found itself supporting an enormous surge in demand for semaglutide alternatives. You could, during this period, obtain a compounded version of semaglutide, often through telehealth platforms and online pharmacies that had proliferated rapidly to meet the surging demand, typically at a considerably lower price point than the brand-name medication, an appealing option for patients priced out of or simply unable to locate the officially approved product through normal pharmacy channels. The problem, as regulators and public health officials increasingly warned throughout this period, was that these compounded versions existed in a regulatory grey zone considerably murkier than the tightly controlled manufacturing process required for FDA-approved medications, meaning dosing consistency, purity, and overall product quality varied considerably from one compounding source to another, in a manner uncomfortably reminiscent of the inconsistent, unregulated ephedra and hoodia products that had proliferated during earlier supplement industry gaps decades before. Reports began emerging of adverse events linked to compounded semaglutide products, including cases involving incorrect dosing, contamination, and the use of different salt forms of the active ingredient that hadn't undergone the same rigorous safety testing as the FDA-approved versions, prompting increasingly urgent warnings from regulators about the risks of obtaining these products outside of properly licensed, carefully monitored supply chains. Simultaneously, a parallel and equally concerning market emerged for counterfeit versions of the actual brand name medications themselves, with fraudulent products entering the supply chain through various channels and creating genuine safety risks for patients who believed they were receiving authentic, properly manufactured Ozempic or Wegovy, but were in fact receiving products of entirely unknown composition and quality. The manufacturer worked to expand production capacity throughout this period, gradually working to address the underlying shortage, while regulators worked simultaneously to crack down on the most concerning compounding and counterfeiting practices, creating an ongoing, unresolved tension between patient access, drug safety, and pure market economics that continued to play out well into the middle of the decade. This entire episode carries an unmistakable echo of patterns that have repeated throughout this whole 2-century history. A genuinely effective, high-demand product creating a supply gap that gets filled, almost inevitably, by less regulated, less carefully monitored alternatives, whether that gap was filled by tapeworm eggs sold through newspaper advertisements in the 1800s, ephedra supplements sold under a dietary loophole in the 1990s, or compounded semaglutide sold through telehealth platforms in the 2020s. The fundamental human desire driving this entire history, the wish for an effective, accessible solution to a difficult and deeply personal struggle, has remained essentially unchanged across 200 years, even as the chemistry, the marketing, and the regulatory landscape around it have shifted dramatically again and again. Whether the current generation of GLP-1 medications ultimately represents the field's long-awaited genuine breakthrough, or simply the latest chapter in a much longer, considerably more complicated story, is a question history has not yet finished answering. Sold under the brand name Desoxin starting in the 1940s, methamphetamine hydrochloride was, quite literally, medical-grade meth prescribed to you by a physician in a white coat for the crime of wanting to fit into a smaller pair of trousers. It worked exactly as well as you'd expect a Schedule II stimulant to work, and it also came with the exact side effects you'd expect, though somehow that took decades longer to sink in than it probably should have. Methamphetamine had been synthesized decades earlier and had already seen extensive use during the Second World War, distributed to soldiers and even factory workers to combat fatigue, and sustain long hours of demanding labour, meaning by the time disoxin arrived on the civilian medical market, the compound already carried a track record of use, if not yet a full understanding of its long-term consequences. Marketed initially for a surprisingly broad range of conditions including depression, narcolepsy, and notably obesity, disoxin was prescribed with a casualness that mirrored the broader amphetamine enthusiasm sweeping through American medicine during the same period, treated as simply a more potent member of the same stimulant family already being handed out for weight loss under brand names like Benzedrine. You'd take your disoxin tablet and experience an intensity of appetite suppression and energy that made even standard amphetamines feel comparatively mild, a genuinely powerful pharmacological effect that made losing weight feel almost effortless in the short term, at the direct cost of introducing your body to one of the most habit-forming, neurologically disruptive substances available in any legal or illegal market. Then or now. The line between prescribed medical methamphetamine and the illicit street drug that would eventually devastate communities across the country decades later was, chemically speaking, essentially non-existent. A fact that seems almost unbelievable in hindsight, given how thoroughly the illicit version of the drug would come to be understood as one of the most dangerous and destructive substances in existence. Physicians prescribing disoxin for weight management throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s were, in effect, handing patients a legal, physician-sanctioned pathway into methamphetamine dependency, often without any meaningful discussion of the drug's addictive potential or the psychological and physical toll that sustained use could inflict over time. Patients reported the same constellation of effects that would later become infamous in discussions of methamphetamine abuse more broadly: severe insomnia, significant weight loss that frequently overshot any reasonable target, dental problems associated with dry mouth and teeth grinding, paranoia, and a profound psychological dependency that made discontinuing the medication extraordinarily difficult once a patient's body and brain chemistry had adapted to its presence. As awareness of amphetamine abuse broadly intensified throughout the 1960s and into the regulatory crackdowns of the 1970s, disoxin specifically drew increasing scrutiny given its particularly potent chemical profile, and its approved medical uses were narrowed considerably, eventually restricted to only the most severe, treatment-resistant cases of obesity and attention deficit disorder, prescribed under increasingly strict controlled substance regulations that reflected the government's dawning recognition of exactly how dangerous this particular medication truly was. Remarkably, disoxin never entirely disappeared from the American pharmaceutical landscape, remaining technically available by prescription even today for a very narrow set of treatment-resistant conditions. A strange historical footnote that means the same active chemical compound responsible for one of the most devastating illicit drug epidemics in American history has also, quietly and continuously, remained a legally prescribable medication throughout the entire span of that epidemic's development. Looking back at disoxin's introduction and early popularity, it stands as perhaps the starkest possible illustration of how thoroughly the medical establishment underestimated amphetamine's dangers during this era, a moment when handing a patient legal methamphetamine to help them lose a few pounds seemed like a perfectly reasonable, unremarkable medical decision, rather than the genuinely alarming choice it appears to be with the benefit of many decades of hindsight. It's the kind of detail that tends to stop a modern audience cold. The idea that somewhere in America, a physician once handed a patient a legal bottle of methamphetamine and sent them on their way with nothing more than a friendly reminder to take it with breakfast. Beginning in the 1950s and roaring back with a vengeance in the 2000s, you were offered a diet built around daily injections of human chorionic gonadotropin, a hormone typically associated with early pregnancy. paired with a diet so restrictive it hovered somewhere around 500 calories a day. The hormone itself did essentially nothing measurable for fat loss, but starving yourself nearly to the point of fainting will absolutely make the number on the scale drop, which is a fact the injections were happy to take credit for. The HCG diet originated with a British endocrinologist who, working in the 1950s, theorized that daily injections of this pregnancy-associated hormone could help redistribute stored body fat and, critically, suppress hunger enough to make an extraordinarily restrictive 500-calorie daily diet tolerable, a claim that would have seemed remarkable if it had been true, and that unfortunately has never been substantiated by any rigorous, controlled scientific research conducted in the decades since. You'd visit a clinic offering the treatment and receive a daily injection, sometimes self-administered at home after initial training, while adhering to a diet so severely restricted that it fell dramatically below the caloric intake considered safe for sustained use by essentially every mainstream medical and nutritional authority. A regimen that would produce significant rapid weight loss for the simple and entirely predictable reason that consuming 500 calories a day puts your body into a state of significant caloric deficit, regardless of whatever hormone happens to be simultaneously injected alongside it. Proponents of the diet pointed enthusiastically to the dramatic visible results patients achieved, often losing a pound or more per day during the most restrictive phase of treatment, presenting this rapid loss as clear evidence that the HCG injections were doing something remarkable, when in reality virtually identical results could be, and repeatedly have been, achieved through the caloric restriction alone, with the injected hormone contributing nothing measurable beyond a placebo effect and a considerably higher price tag. Clinical research conducted throughout the decades following the diet's initial introduction consistently failed to demonstrate that HCG injections produced any weight loss benefit beyond what the extreme caloric restriction alone would be expected to achieve, findings so consistent and so clear that regulatory and medical authorities have repeatedly and publicly stated that the hormone itself offers no legitimate role in weight management, a conclusion that has done remarkably little to dampen the diet's persistent popularity across multiple resurgences over the following 70 years. The diet's most significant resurgence arrived in the 2000s, driven substantially by a best-selling diet book and by an expanding network of clinics and online sellers offering HCG products, sometimes in injectable form requiring a prescription, but increasingly marketed as homeopathic drops or sprays, sold without any prescription requirement whatsoever, despite these non-injectable formulations typically containing such minuscule, diluted amounts of the actual hormone that they couldn't plausibly produce any physiological effect at all, hormonal or otherwise. This second wave of popularity prompted renewed regulatory attention, with health authorities issuing public warnings about both the lack of scientific support for the hormone's claimed benefits and the genuine medical risks associated with sustained 500-calorie daily diets, which can include muscle loss, gallstones, electrolyte imbalances, fatigue, and nutritional deficiencies severe enough to cause lasting harm if maintained for extended periods without appropriate medical supervision. Regulatory agencies have taken action against various companies marketing over-the-counter HCG products for weight loss, citing both false and misleading advertising claims and safety concerns, though the fundamentally decentralized, clinic-based and online nature of the diet's continued distribution has made comprehensive enforcement genuinely difficult to achieve. The persistent appeal of the HCG diet across 7 decades and multiple regulatory crackdowns offers a particularly clear illustration of a recurring theme throughout this entire history. Dramatic, rapid, visually satisfying results tend to overwhelm and outlast whatever scientific evidence, or lack thereof, actually explains why those results occurred in the first place. A pattern that has proven remarkably resistant to correction, regardless of how many decades of contrary research accumulate in the meantime. In the years following the 1997 recall, you watched the maker of phentermine face one of the largest pharmaceutical litigation settlements in American history, eventually paying out over $20 billion to users who had developed heart valve damage. It became the cautionary tale every future diet drug company would be quietly terrified of repeating, which is precisely why every drug afterward arrived buried under so many warning labels it practically needed its own pamphlet. The legal aftermath of the fen-phen recall began almost immediately following the drug's withdrawal, as patients who had undergone cardiac screening and discovered valve damage they had never suspected began filing individual lawsuits against the manufacturer, alleging that the company had failed to adequately warn patients and physicians about risks that internal research and post-market surveillance should have identified considerably earlier than they ultimately did. The sheer volume of affected patients, combined with the clear medically documented nature of the harm involved, meaning valve damage that could be objectively confirmed through echocardiogram imaging rather than relying on more subjective or disputable injury claims, created ideal conditions for the litigation to expand rapidly from scattered individual lawsuits into a massive, coordinated legal effort involving tens of thousands of plaintiffs across the country. The manufacturer initially attempted to resolve the mounting legal exposure through a proposed nationwide settlement in the late 1990s, but the scale of the problem and the eventual recognition that considerably more patients had been harmed than the original settlement framework had anticipated led to a series of escalating revised settlement structures over the following years as the true scope of the cardiac damage became clearer through continued patient screening and follow-up research. By the time settlement negotiations and payouts had largely concluded, well over a decade after the original recall, the cumulative financial cost to the manufacturer had grown to become one of the largest pharmaceutical liability settlements in American legal history up to that point. A figure that reflected not just the number of patients affected, but the severity and permanence of cardiac valve damage in many of the most seriously injured cases, some of whom required eventual surgical valve replacement or repair as a direct consequence of their fen-phen use years earlier. The legal proceedings also generated extensive documentation and discovery, revealing internal company communications and research data from the period leading up to the drug's approval and subsequent widespread use, material that plaintiffs' attorneys argued demonstrated the company had access to warning signs about cardiac risks considerably earlier than it had acted upon them, allegations that, while contested by the manufacturer throughout the litigation, contributed significantly to the scale of the eventual settlements and to the broader public perception of the case as a genuine corporate accountability failure, rather than simply an unfortunate, unforeseeable medical discovery. The fen-phen litigation fundamentally reshaped how pharmaceutical companies throughout the industry approach the development, marketing, and post-approval monitoring of new weight loss medications in the years that followed, introducing a level of institutional caution and legal risk awareness that had simply not existed during the more freewheeling decades of amphetamine and rainbow pill prescribing. Every subsequent diet drug brought to market following the fen-phen settlements arrived accompanied by considerably more extensive warning labels, more rigorous and more extended safety monitoring requirements, and more conservative marketing language, all of it shaped directly by pharmaceutical company lawyers determined never to find their own organization facing a settlement of comparable scale. This shift helps explain the notably more cautious, incremental character of drugs like Belvic and Simia compared to the confident sweeping promises that had defined fen-phen's original marketing. A caution born not primarily out of scientific humility, but out of genuine, well-founded corporate fear of exactly the kind of catastrophic legal and financial reckoning that fen-phen's manufacturer had been forced to endure. In this sense, the fen-phen lawsuits represent one of the rare moments in this entire two-century history where the consequences of a dangerous weight loss drug produced a lasting structural change in how the entire industry subsequently operated, even if that change was motivated considerably more by liability avoidance than by any deeper transformation in how aggressively new weight loss compounds continued to be pursued and marketed. Years before semaglutide became a household name, its chemical cousin liraglutide was already quietly doing the same job under the brand name Saxenda, approved in 2014 as a daily injection for chronic weight management. You mostly ignored it at the time, since a daily shot for modest results didn't have quite the same magic as what was coming. But in hindsight, Saxenda was the quiet opening act nobody realized was warming up the crowd for the headliner. Liraglutide had actually been developed and approved years earlier, in 2010, as a treatment for type 2 diabetes under the brand name Victoza, working through the same fundamental GLP-1 receptor agonist mechanism that would later make semaglutide such a cultural phenomenon. Mimicking a naturally occurring hormone that regulates blood sugar, slows the emptying of the stomach, and signals feelings of fullness to the brain. Physicians treating diabetic patients with Victoza noticed, much as they would later notice with early semaglutide use, that patients frequently experienced meaningful, sometimes substantial weight loss as a secondary effect of their diabetes treatment, an observation that prompted the manufacturer to pursue a dedicated weight management formulation, resulting in Saxenda's approval in 2014 at a higher daily dose specifically intended for chronic weight management in patients without diabetes. You'd administer your Saxenda injection daily, a notably more frequent commitment than the once-weekly schedule that would later make semaglutide considerably more convenient and appealing, and experience a genuine, clinically meaningful reduction in appetite and corresponding weight loss over the following months of treatment, results that were real and represented a genuine advance over many previous generations of weight loss medication in this history, without carrying the alarming cardiovascular or valve-related risks that had derailed so many earlier attempts at effective appetite suppression. Clinical trial data supporting Saxenda's approval showed meaningfully better weight loss results compared to placebo, with a reasonably favourable overall safety profile, most side effects involving gastrointestinal symptoms like nausea and diarrhea, rather than the cardiac concerns that had defined so much of this drug category's troubled history. Despite these genuinely positive results, Saxenda never achieved anything close to the explosive cultural and commercial phenomenon that would later engulf semaglutide, a difference in reception that stemmed from several compounding factors working simultaneously against it. The daily injection requirement, compared to semaglutide's more convenient once-weekly dosing schedule, represented a meaningfully higher burden for patients to sustain over the long term, since daily injections are simply a harder habit to maintain consistently than a weekly routine, particularly for a treatment intended to continue indefinitely rather than for a short, defined course. The magnitude of weight loss achieved with Saxenda, while genuinely meaningful and clinically significant, was also notably more modest than what later semaglutide trials would demonstrate, meaning the drug simply didn't generate the kind of dramatic headline-grabbing results that would eventually capture broad public and media attention in the way Wegovy's later approval data managed to achieve so dramatically. Saxenda also arrived at a moment when public and media attention around weight loss medications remained comparatively subdued following the fen-phen and Meridia controversies of the preceding decade. Without the particular convergence of social media culture, celebrity discussion, and broader cultural obsession with rapid, visible transformation that would later supercharge semaglutide's reception just a few years afterward. In retrospect, however, Saxenda's steady, comparatively quiet years on the market proved enormously significant in a way that wasn't fully appreciated at the time, effectively serving as a multi-year real-world proof of concept for the entire GLP-1 receptor agonist approach to weight management, demonstrating that this particular hormonal mechanism could produce genuine, sustained weight loss with a manageable, largely gastrointestinal side effect profile, well before semaglutide arrived to take that same underlying concept and, through a combination of superior dosing convenience, more dramatic clinical results, and considerably more favourable cultural timing, transform it into the most significant weight loss phenomenon this entire 2-century history had ever produced. So here you are, at the end of 200 years of trying to outsmart your own body, and if there's one thing tonight has made abundantly clear, it's that human beings have never once been short on creativity when it comes to avoiding a salad. You drank vinegar until your teeth wore thin. You swallowed a parasite and paid it rent for months. You dosed yourself with the same chemical used to make explosives, and you knew you'd gone too far the moment your skin turned the colour of a school bus. You took pills meant for your heart to feel too sick to want dinner, pills meant to drain your kidneys dry, and pills that turned your bathroom into a second full-time residence. You were handed medical-grade methamphetamine by a physician who called it a diet aid, and you thanked him for it. You believed, for a few genuinely hopeful years in the 1990s, that 2 ordinary pills taken together had finally solved a problem that had eluded medicine for a century and a half, only to discover the solution had been quietly reshaping the valves inside your own chest the entire time. You bought a desert cactus because a marketing team told you an old story about hunters, and you took daily injections of a pregnancy hormone because someone once decided that starving on purpose needed a fancier name. And now, somehow, you've arrived at a weekly injection that actually works the way all the others only ever promised to, and even that comes trailing a supply shortage, a grey market, and the quiet, nagging awareness that you've heard this particular promise before. It would be easy to look back on all of this and simply laugh, and you probably did more than once tonight. There is something almost absurd about the sheer volume of ways people have tried to shortcut their own biology. A parade of pills, powders, injections, and grave miscalculations stretching across 2 centuries, each one utterly convinced it had finally cracked the code. But underneath the dark comedy of it all is something a little more tender and worth sitting with for a moment before you drift off. Every single person swallowing that vinegar, hosting that tapeworm, or waiting nervously for their doctor to hand over that little rattling bag of rainbow pills, was simply a person who wanted to feel comfortable in their own body, who had likely been told in one way or another that they weren't allowed to feel that way as they were. That's not vanity. That's not weakness. That's just what it feels like to be human inside a culture that has spent 200 years insisting there is always one more pill, one more shortcut, one more miracle standing between you and finally being enough. Think, for a moment, about the sheer persistence required to keep trying, decade after decade, generation after generation, even as one supposed miracle after another quietly revealed itself to be dangerous or useless or both. The housewives in the 1950s, cleaning their kitchens at 2 a.m. on legally prescribed speed, weren't foolish. They were doing exactly what they'd been told would make them good enough. The patients lining up outside diet clinics in the 1990s, clutching a prescription for 2 little pills that finally seemed to work, weren't naive. They were hopeful in the most human way possible, after years of being told that hope simply required the right chemistry. Even the people quietly ordering compounded injections online today, waiting anxiously by the mailbox during a supply shortage, are doing what people have always done when the promise of finally feeling comfortable in their own skin seems, for once, within reach. If nothing else, tonight should leave you with a strange kind of tenderness for every one of them, including perhaps versions of yourself. And here's the part worth holding on to as you settle in tonight. Somewhere along this entire journey, in between the poisons and the parasites and the pills, nobody should have been handed so casually. Actual, careful science was slowly, patiently doing its work in the background, learning from every single failure along the way. The rainbow pill era taught doctors that stacking unrelated medications without oversight was a recipe for disaster. The fen-phen scandal taught an entire industry that a drug's most serious risks might not reveal themselves for years, and that patients deserved far more rigorous, far more patient testing before anything ever reached a pharmacy shelf. Ephedra and Hoodia taught regulators that the word natural means considerably less than it sounds like it should, and out of all of that accumulated wreckage, slowly, unglamorously, came the research that eventually led to medications working through mechanisms your body already uses on its own, hormones mimicking hormones, rather than industrial chemicals borrowed from a dye factory or a bomb maker's workbench. That's not nothing. That's 2 centuries of mistakes, genuinely and expensively learned from, even if it took entirely too many yellow-skinned patients and damaged heart valves to get there. So tonight, as you sink into your bed, in a home with a thermostat you can adjust with one finger, on a mattress that isn't stuffed with hay and fleas, without a single tapeworm to your name, maybe spare a quiet thought for everyone across the last 200 years who tried so hard, in ways that now look almost unbelievable, simply to feel at peace with themselves. Spare a thought too for how far the science has actually come, however winding and occasionally horrifying the path, and how much more careful, how much more accountable an entire field has slowly been forced to become. You don't need a pill made from ground-up glands or industrial dye to know you're allowed to rest easy tonight. You don't need to eyeball a dose of nightshade or wonder whether tonight's dinner will pass through you a little too quickly. You're simply here, safe, breathing slowly, under a blanket that isn't shared with a goat, in a century that, whatever its flaws, finally seems to understand that the body deserves patience rather than punishment. Let the last 200 years of vinegar, speed, and yellow-skinned desperation drift quietly out of your mind now. You don't need to solve anything tonight. You don't need to be thinner, faster, or different than you already are in this exact, unremarkable, perfectly sufficient moment. Just let your breathing slow, let your shoulders soften into the mattress, and let the whole strange, occasionally horrifying, occasionally hilarious history of trying to outrun your own hunger settle gently behind you. Sleep now. You've more than earned it, and unlike almost everyone in tonight's story, you didn't have to swallow a single thing to get there.